Since this week is Easter, or rather was Easter by the time you see this, when Christians are celebrating Jesus being alive despite being unable to produce any evidence of life, I thought I would review Lee Strobel's The Case for Easter, a 2004 booklet in which Strobel puts forth his best case for why he thinks there was a resurrection. So get your jelly beans and chocolate eggs and chocolate Jesuses and whatever other Easter treats you enjoy, and let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. I've been losing patrons recently, and I totally get that. The economy is precarious, and I'd rather you gave your money to the content creators that need it to make a living, as this is just a hobby for me. But I will appeal for more views. Play this video twice or share this video with a friend. Additional views will make up for the loss of patrons. Strobel's book is only 63 pages long. As I started the script, I had read the introduction and skimmed Chapter 1. Chapter 1 deals with proving that Jesus died. I found it a complete waste of time, as I have no doubt that if Jesus ever lived, he is dead. If he died by crucifixion, that would be unremarkable, as that was a common practice in first century Rome. The real purpose of Chapter 1 was to set the tone for the book, to gain sympathy of the reader for a man tortured to death, by examining in detail just what death by crucifixion entailed. I'll grant that if Jesus was real and died by crucifixion, he was tortured. But as I said, this was a common practice. Brutality wasn't given the consideration that it is today. I don't know if people had less empathy then, or people feared challenging a system that they felt powerless to change, much like today. If people had less empathy, why has the moral compass that God is supposed to have given people changed so much in the last 2 millennia? Did God have to turn up the empathy because humans were too brutal? If so, why did he himself participate in the brutality in the past? But because I have no reason to try to drum up sympathy for Jesus, and I have no doubt that Jesus is dead, if he ever lived, I'll be skipping over Chapter 1, which is actually nearly 1/3 of the booklet. Strobel does have a second reason for his case that Jesus died. There are some that believe that Jesus didn't really die by crucifixion. Some think that he fainted or he wasn't really dead. Most likely, if he was crucified, he was then thrown into a mass grave where, if he had fainted, he would have died. So again, he is dead. Some say a substitute went to the cross and Jesus was never crucified. Strobel never addresses this theory. He only disputes the possibility that Jesus survived the crucifixion. I'll grant that if Jesus was crucified, he died by crucifixion. But that does nothing for the case for Easter. The linchpin of Christianity is the resurrection. If there was one, Jesus obviously would have need to have died first. But that he died has no bearing on whether or not he was resurrected. In the introduction, Strobel tells the story of being called by a distraught father to find his 19-year-old daughter. The young woman is found to have died of a drug overdose. The girl's father is blind to the girl's life of being a petty thief, gang member, sex worker, and drug addict. Strobel paints the father's inability to see his daughter for what she was as being like the Christian, he was an atheist at the time, that cannot see the facts because of the interference of their faith. It's an apt analogy. In the introduction, Strobel makes the odd statement, "As a reporter, I've seen lots of dead people, and none of them have ever come back to life." Christians could spin fanciful tales of an empty tomb, but they could never change the grim, absolute finality of death. At this point, Strobel says he was an atheist, but he saw lots of dead bodies? Really? That would be true of a war correspondent, but the United States pulled out of Vietnam in 1973, and Strobel began his career with the Chicago Times in '74. Strobel was the legal editor. Why would he be seeing dead bodies? Strobel did win a Pulitzer Prize for his investigation of the Pinto crashes. My guess is that he saw pictures of dead bodies, not actual dead bodies. In doing a legal analysis, it is highly unlikely that he could get to any crash site before the bodies were removed. And even if he did, as a reporter, he would not have been allowed into the area where the police were working. Is Strobel shading the truth even in the introduction? Next, he says that his wife became a Christian. He noticed changes in her character and values. He then said it was time to use his journalism and legal training to thoroughly investigate Christianity so he might be able to liberate her from this cult. I'm curious as to what changes he saw and why he found them problematic. Did she become an insufferable know-it-all? Was she threatening him with hell? Did she suddenly decide it was no longer okay to be gay? Did she start becoming obedient to him and asking for his permission to do things that she used to do on her own? What made him think that the changes were undesirable? Don't most men want their wives to be groveling at their feet? It's possible that he wanted an egalitarian marriage and was disturbed by his wife debasing herself. However, if this was the case, he sure has changed his own values, and not in a good way. Not in keeping with wanting half the population of the earth to flourish as he does. If a reasonable Lee Strobel investigated Christianity in hopes of retaining an equitable marriage, he instead ended up trading his reason for having a servant wife instead of a partner. If this was the case, the movie, The Case for Christ, doesn't bear this out. It portrays Strobel as an angry, drunk atheist who belittled his wife's beliefs. In an interview with Leslie Strobel, Lee's wife, she said she always wanted to stay home and raise her children. Her conversion to Christianity had little effect on what she did. I know Strobel's language is intended to arouse the ire of Christians against atheists, but the picture that he paints of his wife isn't good. He was so bothered by his wife's behavior that he had to find out what she was brainwashed into. But instead of asking his wife what she believed and why, he goes out to disprove the claims of Christianity. I call bullshit.
A bullshit? A bullshit? A bullshit.
There are many different forms of Christianity. If his concern was for his wife, then he should be talking to her or her church leaders, not investigating Christianity in general. He says that he set out to find out if Jesus really died on the cross. Really? How does this have any bearing on his wife's behavior? Now we come to Chapter 2, the evidence of the missing body. Was Jesus' body absent from his tomb?
Anderson.
Here.
Bueller. Bueller. Bueller.
Right off the bat, we have a major assumption, the tomb, that there even was a tomb. Strobel says the issue with Jesus isn't that he was nowhere to be seen. It was that he was seen alive. He was seen dead, and he was seen alive once more. If we believe the gospel accounts, this isn't a matter of a missing body. And that is the crux of the issue. Can you believe the gospel accounts? Obviously, Strobel would say yes. But the entire case he is trying to make is that there was a resurrection. Obviously, 3 of the gospel writers wrote about a resurrection. So if you believe the gospel accounts, you already believe in the resurrection. To assume belief in the gospel accounts is to give away the store. It would be like walking into a courtroom and the prosecuting attorney in a murder case holds up a book that tells you who done it, how and why it was done in detail. The author is dead, so we can't question the author. And we don't know the genre of the book. Is it a novel or is it true crime? And then the prosecuting attorney says, if you believe the book, then the butler did it. Yes, if you believe the book. Now lay out the case for why we should believe the book. He then says it's a matter of Jesus still being alive even to this day, even after publicly succumbing to the horrors of crucifixion so graphically depicted in the preceding chapter. This goes too far. Nowhere do the Gospels say that Jesus is alive today. They can't. They were written 2,000 years ago. The authors couldn't possibly know what is going on today. Christian doctrine makes this claim, but on what basis? Primarily in the claim of this verse, "Lo, I am with you always," and the promise of his return and judgment at the end of the world. Paul thought the end of the world would come in his lifetime. Jesus also thought that that end was imminent. Additionally, if Jesus was in a physical body after his resurrection, and that body rose up into the sky, he would die. If Jesus ascended, he died in the ascension and is once again dead. If this was a spirit body that ascended, one doesn't need oxygen. One can stand the cold vacuousness of space. What was the purpose then of the empty tomb? The spirit could just get up out of the physical body, leaving the physical body behind. The whole empty tomb thing was pointless. Strobel then turns to who he feels is the expert that can provide the evidence of a resurrection. It's William Lane Craig. Yep, low bar Bill.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
In a recent interview, Bill doubled down on his claim that one doesn't need evidence for Christianity, because if there is just one chance in a million that it's true, in his opinion, it's worth believing.
Do you think that because of the radical nature of the claim being made here, not just involving the miracles of Jesus' ministry and the resurrection, but also the moral importance of this story and the fact that it's supposed to be essentially the central event of human history, that although we may have a higher standard of historical evidence compared to other average historical facts, we should expect a much higher standard of evidence, perhaps even higher than what we have available to us as it stands?
Yeah, I don't agree with that attitude at all, Alex. And I got myself into some controversy by saying this. Recently, it seems to me that in virtue of what's at stake in believing in the existence of God and Christ, that it would be wrong to demand higher standards of evidence for this. If anything, it would seem to me that one would be more ready to believe if there's any sort of shred of evidence.
Even Lobar Bill, by this, admits that the evidence for a resurrection isn't good. If it was, his own belief would be based on the evidence, rather than his opinion that he wants so badly for it to be true, that there is just one chance in a million that if it is true, that he would believe it. Further, Bill's own conversion story isn't about his finding evidence for a resurrection. It's about personal experience, followed by wanting to find reasons for his faith. Strobel then makes an extraordinary claim. He says Craig debated a spokesman for American atheists, powerfully building the case for Christianity, such that at the end, 82% of those who were atheists when they walked in exited, concluding the case for Christianity to be compelling. He claims 47 people entered as non-believers and exited as Christians. Note that he doesn't say who the spokesperson is. Craig has debated many atheists, so I had no idea which one it was. He gave no date or location for this event. However, I did find what debate Strobel was referring to. It was a debate in 1993 between Craig and Frank Zindler. Strobel was the moderator. It took place at Willow Creek Church in South Barrington, Illinois. At the end, Strobel reads this result.
The atheist position received, I'm just trying to read, the handwriting's not too good, but the atheist position received 157 votes for 3% of the total. The Christian position received 6,011 votes for a total of 97%.
Hardly surprising, considering the venue. Oh, and this is Craig.
How do you know that the views that you hold to aren't simply the result of physical stimuli rather than rationality? I think that atheism is ultimately destructive of rationality itself.
He looks a little different then, doesn't he? Strobel says the atheist position received 157 votes, and the Christian position 6,011 votes. Most likely, many of the atheists and skeptics found that Craig did a better job in the debate, not that they found Craig's position compelling. The way Strobel words this, it implies that the 47 that convert had been atheists or skeptics. But it doesn't say this. It's entirely possible, probable even, that the 47 were people that believed but hadn't yet committed to Christianity. Strobel then spends the next 2 pages describing Craig, before finally getting to the subject. He rightly recognizes that before looking at whether the tomb of Jesus was empty, I needed to establish whether his body had been there in the first place. Indeed. Strobel asks, based on customary practice, wouldn't it be unlikely that Jesus was buried in a tomb? To which Craig responds, if all you looked at was customary practice, yes, I'd agree. But that would ignore the specific evidence in this case. Craig then points to 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, claiming that this early creed mentions a burial. Craig claims then that because the creed was early, it therefore is trustworthy. First problem with this evidence is it doesn't put Jesus in a tomb, the thing Strobel acknowledged that he needed to establish, only that he was buried. Being buried in a mass grave with other convicted criminals fits this perfectly. Second, this creed saying what Christians believed doesn't attest to the truth of their belief, only that they believed it. Many people in the first century had many different creeds about their faiths. That doesn't make them true, nor does reciting a creed early after the founding of the religion. How soon after deciding they believe they come up with the creed about their beliefs has no bearing on the truth of their beliefs. Strobel asks Craig about the tomb. Craig's response is that it's in all 4 Gospels, and that Mark's Gospel, being the first written, is likely accurate because it's early. He claims there wasn't time for legendary corruption. I find this claim laughable, considering the Gospel of Mark is the most corrupt text in the Bible that we know of. The entire long ending, verses 9-20 of Mark 16, were likely added by a later scribe as they don't appear in the earliest manuscripts. But the oldest manuscript we have of Mark is Papias 137, which contains some of chapter 1, none of the tomb story, and dates to about the 2nd or 3rd century. We don't have a complete gospel until about 370 CE. There were over 300 years for legendary corruption before we get any evidence of what the Mark author said on the matter. Strobel then asks why Joseph of Arimathea would vote for Jesus to die, and then ask for the body, as Mark has the council vote unanimously to condemn Jesus. Craig says Luke noticed this and adds detail, that Joseph was absent. This doesn't fix the problem. In Mark's Gospel, he is clear that the whole council of the Sanhedrin are there. Mark doesn't have Joseph as a member of the Sanhedrin, only a member of the council, without specifying what council. What Craig leaves out is that Matthew doesn't have Joseph being a member of the council at all. He's just a rich man and a follower of Jesus. John has him being a secret disciple for fear of the Jewish leaders. Again, not a member of the Sanhedrin. If there was no time for legendary embellishment, why did the identity of Joseph of Arimathea get changed so much between the different Gospels? Worse, there has never been found a town of Arimathea for Joseph to be from. Joseph isn't at the tomb for the resurrection, nor has he ever heard from again. He is nowhere to be found before the death of Jesus and nowhere to be found afterwards. He has this one appearance to conveniently ask for and get the body. He has all the markings of a made-up literary character. Finally, Mark's Gospel has the crucifixion being at 3 p.m. He's quite clear about this. Joseph goes to Pilate and asks for the body as evening approached. Pilate asks that Jesus' death be verified. Could Joseph really have waited for that verification, got permission to get the body, go get the spices with Nicodemus, and then place Jesus in the tomb, anoint him with the spices, and roll the stone in front of the grave all before nightfall? This indeed stretches credulity. Perhaps God miraculously made the earth stand still so they could get this all done in time. On page 34, Craig says that Jesus was in the tomb before sundown Friday, in order to get in the 3 days in the tomb prophecy. There is no way that Joseph and Nicodemus could have prepared the body and got it in the tomb by then. Maybe the 3 p.m. part of Mark's Gospel is another thing that goes out the window.
Throw it out the window.
The Gospel of Peter fixes this problem by having Joseph ask for the body before Jesus is even dead. Strobel quotes Craig as saying, "The majority of the New Testament scholars agree that the burial account of Jesus is fundamentally reliable." And while that statement is still true, Gary Habermas has to remove the empty tomb from his minimal facts, as that is not agreed on by large enough majority to be considered a fact. Strobel concludes, "Craig's explanations satisfied me that Jesus' body was indeed placed in Joseph's tomb." I think Strobel failed to ask the important questions, like who was Joseph of Arimathea, since he has different descriptions in the different Gospels? And when did he ask for the body? Did he and Nicodemus work well into the night to prep the body? And if they did, they would have broken the Sabbath. According to 3 of the Gospels, it was Passover, and they would have needed to be home for the Passover meal. Of course, John's Gospel says it was past Passover, as that occurred with the Last Supper, which is why experts can't say when Jesus' death is supposed to have occurred. What day Passover fell on, Thursday or Saturday, would determine what years it could possibly have been. Craig then explains why, from the Creed, he claims to know the tomb was empty. It's because of the Jewish beliefs about the final resurrection, which would be a physical resurrection of the bones, not just a spiritual resurrection. This fails to note that, according to the Scriptures part of the Creed, is inaccurate. There was no prophecy that Jesus or the Messiah would be raised from the dead. Jesus can't be raised according to the Scriptures because there were no Scriptures for him to be raised according to. This also brings us back to the ascension problem. If Jesus' body, bones and all, were raised from the dead, where did the body go? Even if God put a magic spaceship around Jesus to preserve his body as he traveled through space to heaven, where did the body go? I know of no Christian that thinks heaven is a physical place in our physical universe. If the body is going to a spiritual dimension, does this dimension have physical properties? If not, a physical body can't exist there. And if so, then it must have a location. If it's outside the universe, there must be a multiverse. What's more, if God is going to have to magic Jesus' body over there, what was the purpose of the ascension? To wow the crowd? If that was it, he didn't do very well. There weren't very many people there to start with. And there's no report of the people being in awe of this spectacular event and coming to believe as a result, which, when you look at first century mythology, makes perfect sense. The gods are supposed to live in the clouds. Seeing gods come and go to the cloud realm is common in their mythology. Why would Jesus be any different? At least not if he were just another mythological god. The next thing Strobel says that Craig told him is either confirmation bias or poor scholarship on Craig's part. This is history, not philosophy, so it is out of Craig's wheelhouse. Craig claims that archaeologists have found first-century tombs have a slanted groove that led down to a low entrance. A disc-shaped stone was rolled in front of the entrance in that groove, and a smaller stone secured the large stone in place. This is neither common practice nor plausible. Of 900 tombs dating to the Second Temple period, only 4 had round ceiling stones, as Craig describes, and all 4 belonged to royalty. Most tombs had a square or rectangular ceiling stone. The idea of a round one comes from the gospel claim that the stone was rolled away. It could not have been. It could have been pushed away, but not rolled away. Strobel says Craig dismisses the guard story as it is rejected by many scholars. While I applaud Craig in being able to let go of the aspects of the story and stick to the scholarship, that does serious damage to the credibility of the Matthew Gospel. Does Craig think the Bible to be the Word of God? If so, why would he put inaccurate data in his book? Craig also says Genesis 1 through 11 are mythohistory. Since the majority of scholars also discount the Exodus story and the conquest of Canaan, does he accept that these may not have happened? Most scholars don't think that Paul wrote all of the books attributed to him. Does he accept this scholarship as well? How much of the book do scholars need to whittle away before you accept that it's just a human book about a human religion, no God needed? Strobel then moves to the contradictions in the Easter story from the various Gospels. Craig makes no attempt to reconcile the gospel accounts, but rather says that despite there being differences about what time of day it was, the position of the stone, the number and names of the women present, whether they left happy or afraid, whether they told the disciples or not, how many angels and or young men were present, and whether or not they were in the garden, on the stone, or in the tomb, he says, matters not. He says the core of the story is consistent. In all of them, Jesus is risen.
He left out some important information, but that is the gist of it.
He says that is all that matters, but not quite in those words. I think it only matters if you are claiming this to be the infallible Word of God. If this is just some men writing the story they heard about some event, then yes, it makes sense to have these discrepancies. But if the Holy Spirit is supposed to be inspiring all of the different authors, why are the authors getting different messages? As to the silence of the women in Mark, Craig said this had to be a temporary silence. Otherwise, how did the gospel writer know about the event? This question can be asked of much of what is in the gospel accounts. How do the authors know about the transfiguration? None of them were there. The angel's visit to Mary to announce Jesus' birth. Jesus' prayer while in the garden alone. How did the authors find about any of these things? Does Craig think that they sat down in a group and each told the authors their part of the story? Are the authors supposed to have spoken to the parties involved? None of that gives you the prayer in the garden. That's why the Holy Spirit is supposed to be whispering in the author's ear what happened so the author can write it down. In which case, you don't need the women to tell anyone. You just need the Holy Spirit to whisper it into the author's ear. But I don't think Craig can do this with the Galilee-Jerusalem problem. Did Jesus first meet the disciples in Jerusalem and tell them to remain there, and then meet them in Galilee anyway, like one apologist told me? Or did they all travel 80 miles to Galilee for breakfast with Jesus after seeing him at the empty tomb, and then 80 miles back to Galilee that same morning to meet Jesus on the road to Emmaus in the afternoon, and then back to Jerusalem that evening, as another apologist told me? Or does Craig just say that the gist of the story is that Jesus rose, where he did it, who saw him, and when, doesn't matter. All that matters is that it happened?
He left out some important information, but that is the gist of it.
Craig next goes into why the women go to the tomb when they don't know how to move the stone. He says their love for Jesus caused them to seek a way. He ignores that John's Gospel says it was already done by Joseph and Nicodemus. He could have just said that they didn't tell them, but that would be cruel, causing them to lug 90 pounds of spices when it was totally unnecessary. On the other hand, considering they didn't get there until at or after sundown, they may have needed to hide the fact that they broke the Sabbath, and on the Passover too, according to 3 of the Gospels. Craig then answers the question of why, if Jesus' tomb is empty, did the disciples or Paul not talk about it? For Peter, he points to this sermon in Acts and finds implication that it hints at an empty tomb, as he contrasts the tomb of David with that of Jesus. This is a common interpretation among Christians. However, if Peter was schooled in the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's very unlikely that he was, he would have only gotten what Jesus said. This is not the Jewish interpretation of this passage. In Judaism, there is no expectation of a resurrecting Messiah in the mainstream sects. The passages Christians point to as prophecy of a rising Messiah are interpretations exclusive to Christianity, despite the book being shared by 3 major religions. As to Paul, Craig points out this sermon by Paul in Acts, which does indeed support the notion of an empty tomb. However, the author of Acts, whoever that may be, is unlikely to have been a companion of Paul. I'll just leave a link to Bart Ehrman's blog on the topic. The sermon is inconsistent with what Paul wrote and is unlikely to be anything that he said. Paul's Jesus may never have even been a living person. There is nothing in anything Paul wrote about Jesus that points to him ever having lived on earth. Paul saw a vision of Jesus in the celestial realm and never mentions a birth, a mother, an earthly ministry, a quotation, or anything that would indicate that he had an earthly life. Thus, I think we can discount this sermon as ever having been uttered by Paul. Next, Strobel asks Craig for his reasons for thinking that there was an empty tomb. Up until now, Craig has been answering Strobel's questions on common objections, though it's interesting how Strobel simply accepts anything Craig says without pushback, as if there is no reasonable response. This is hardly the reaction I would expect of a skeptic with a legal analytic approach to the subject. Craig's first piece of evidence for an empty tomb is the 1 Corinthians Creed, which again has no empty tomb, just a burial and being raised. Second, he says the site of the tomb was known and claims it would be impossible for a religion to begin in the very city where the tomb was located and he was publicly executed and buried. Would it? The first time a sermon about a resurrection is recorded to have been preached was by Peter on the day of Pentecost, some 50 days after the burial. Even if what Craig said was true, that they knew where the tomb was and could go look, Jesus would have been so decomposed as to be beyond recognition. They would have no way of knowing any body in there was Jesus or not. Now clearly Craig thinks that they would find the tomb empty, but why would they go look? Anyone convinced by Peter's sermon already believes and has no reason to look. Anyone not convinced, again, has no reason to look. I certainly don't look up every claim made by people sermonizing on topics I don't accept. And I have the internet at my fingertips. These people would need to go out of the city to find this tomb. It's not a long trip, but it's a sufficient effort that one wouldn't bother with it unless it was a real issue for them. Next, it was the practice for Jewish people to take the bones of a dead person and put them in an ossuary about a year after the death to allow the tomb to be used again. This would limit the time frame in which anyone could go to the tomb and look for Jesus' body, from about 50 days after death until about a year afterward. In other words, about 300 days total. Anyone not hearing Peter's original sermon would have no such opportunity. Paul was converted about 2 years after Jesus' death. Even if Paul preached an empty tomb, by the time he was preaching, there would be no opportunity to check an empty tomb. Regardless of what happened to Jesus' body, one would expect his tomb to be empty by the time that Paul was preaching. Finally, would they know where the tomb was? Craig claims that Jesus was publicly killed and buried. Killed, according to the narrative, yes, but buried, no. Supposedly, an individual asked for the body and laid it in his own tomb. Is he supposed to have told Pilate where the tomb was? If he did, would Pilate care? Is he supposed to have blown trumpets announcing that he was going to bury the body? If not, how was the burial public? Today, no one knows where this tomb is supposed to be. There are 3 suggested sites, and one is favored by the Christian Church. Constantine set out to find Jesus' tomb in 380 CE. The site he found and claimed to be the correct one is the one to this day favored by Christians to be the actual tomb of Jesus. However, if there was uncertainty in 380 as to the location of the tomb, on what basis does Craig claim that the location was well known? Finally, Bart Ehrman points to the 1 Corinthians Creed, which names Cephas as having seen Jesus, James having believed, and mentions the 12, but there is no mention of Joseph of Arimathea. Ehrman cites this as a likely indication that there was disagreement among the early Christians about the Joseph of Arimathea tomb story. Craig's 6th evidence is that the earliest Jewish polemic presupposes the historicity of the empty tomb. He claims there was nobody claiming the tomb still contained Jesus' body. Dale Ellison disputes this claim because of the uncertainty of the age of the polemic. There certainly were early Christians that didn't believe in an empty tomb, the Marcionites and the Gnostics being 2 examples that denied Jesus ever had a physical body, let alone that it was ever buried in a tomb. Craig's wording here is careful. There was nobody claiming the tomb still contained Jesus' body, leaving one with the implication that there was agreement about an empty tomb. He fails to mention that among early Christians, there was no agreement about a physical body even existing in the first place, let alone that it was ever in a tomb that was now empty. At this point, it is remarkable all of Craig's evidences of an empty tomb come from the Bible. If the entire point of this endeavor is to discover if the Bible is historical, how is reading the book ever going to get you there? That would be like wanting to know if the events in the Iliad were historical and your only research was to read the Iliad. No, you research Greek history to find out if this is historical. That Craig can't point to a single historical reference to an empty tomb casts serious doubt about the historicity of an empty tomb. Strobel then asks that despite alternative theories of why the tomb was empty, just ignore that Strobel seems to have already accepted that there was a tomb and that it was empty for now, isn't an improbable theory more likely than that of a miracle? Craig's reply concludes with, as long as the existence of God is even possible, it's possible that he acted in history by raising Jesus from the dead. Low bar bill indeed. I could just as easily rephrase that to, as long as the existence of the flying spaghetti monster is even possible, it's possible that he acted in history to wrap Jesus' body in pasta and fling it into outer space. Once you add magic to the formula, of course anything is possible. But if we want to know what is historical, we need to connect the data points with what is probable. Magic isn't probable. That there never was an empty tomb or even a tomb burial is probable. The real problem here is we have no data points to connect. All we have is the stories from the 1st and 2nd centuries about what people believed. These are not historical data points. Thus, from a historical perspective, we can draw no reasonable conclusions. Next, Strobel turns to appearances. He goes to see Gary Habermas. He quotes Habermas as saying, "I'll start with evidence that virtually all critical scholars will admit. Nobody questions that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and we have him affirming in 2 places that he personally encountered the resurrected Christ. First, it isn't true that no one questions that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. Granted that those that dispute this are in an extreme minority. Nevertheless, the dispute exists. It exists primarily with the few that argue that Paul never existed as a person. There are no historical sources for the existence of Paul outside of the Bible. The undisputed letters are evidence of his existence, but there are more disputed letters than undisputed. I'm not making the argument that 1 Corinthians isn't authentic or that Paul didn't exist, merely that the evidence is scarce, thus opening the door to those that don't accept that. Habermas overstates his case by making the falsifiable claim that no one disputes this, when clearly Human Dietering, see the fabricated Paul, does just that. More importantly, Habermas overstates his case in claiming that Paul claimed to have seen a risen Jesus. His evidence is in 1 Corinthians 9:1 and 15:8. He says that he has seen Jesus and that Jesus appeared to him. In neither case does he claim to have seen a risen Jesus, a physical body. Habermas assumes, since Jesus was dead and Paul claims to have seen him, that Paul must be referring to having seen a resurrected Jesus. James Tabor disputes that Paul ever saw a resurrected Jesus. He writes, Paul believes that at the appearance of Jesus in the clouds of heaven, the dead, long ago decayed or turned to dust and ashes, will be raised in this glorious imperishable state, as those living are similarly transformed from flesh to spirit, instantaneously, in the blink of an eye. In other words, for Paul, resurrection of the dead is centered on the question of whether those few who have died will also participate in this transformation, along with those living at the time. It's not about reviving the dead, but transforming mortal descendants of Adam to this new level of existence that Jesus, who was once a flesh and blood, has now experienced. It all centers on heavenly exaltation and glorification. For Paul, the issue is not whether those who have died in Christ will be raised, so much as they will participate, despite having died, in this heavenly transformation. And he answers with a resounding yes. Paul believes that Jesus died, was buried, and was raised to a level of heavenly glorification far above even the angels. He accordingly declares that those living and dead in Christ will experience that same transformation. Paul refers to knowing Jesus by revelation. He refers to his vision of Jesus in 2 Corinthians 12. Paul never says that he saw a risen Jesus. Rather, he had a vision and a revelation of Jesus. Strobel's first challenge to Habermas is to convince him 1 Corinthians is a creed. Really? I know of no one who doubts that this is a creed. Habermas claims of this creed. On the face of it, this is incredibly influential testimony that Jesus did appear alive after his death. Here are the names of specific individuals and groups of people who saw him, written at a time when people could check them out if they wanted confirmation. Really? Who would they ask? Peter and James are the only two listed by name. James was executed in 44 CE, and Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in 53 to 55 CE. No one reading Paul's letter could go and ask James. The 12 are listed. Where would one go about finding the 12? Other than Peter and John, the rest of the disciples disappear from the Bible, following the choosing of Matthias to replace Judas as an apostle in chapter 1 of Acts. After that, we have no idea where to find the apostles. How could anybody possibly ask them? The case for the 500 is even weaker. Where did this appearance to the 500 take place? When? How would anyone go about seeking out one of the 500? Consult a magic mirror?
Magic mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?
On page 46, Strobel quotes Habermas as making this odd claim about the 500. Paul apparently had some proximity to these people, he says, most of whom were still living, though some have fallen asleep. Paul either knew some of these people or was told by someone who knew them that they were still walking around and willing to be interviewed. Now stop and think about it. You would never include this phrase unless you were absolutely confident that these folks would confirm that they really did see Jesus alive. I mean, Paul was virtually inviting people to check it out for themselves. He couldn't have said this if he didn't know that they'd back him up. Habermas has just finished giving his case for why this is undoubtedly a creed, and now he claims that these are Paul's personal remarks about people that he personally knew? Really? Why would Christians be reciting a creed about people that Paul knows personally? Why would reciting a creed be an invitation to interview the people mentioned in the creed? How is Paul's including this creed in his letter to the Corinthians suddenly become an event that Paul has personal knowledge of? And of course, there is still the pesky problem of the Corinthian people that get this letter having no way of knowing where to go to check out these claims. I am absolutely flabbergasted that in one breath Habermas claims that this is a creed, and then in the next claims that these are personal remarks of Paul about people of whom he has personal knowledge. After Habermas speculates that this probably occurred in Galilee during the 40 days that Jesus was allegedly walking around resurrected, wouldn't Josephus have reported on this appearance to the 500? To which Habermas makes this bizarre claim. No, I don't think that's necessarily true. Josephus was writing 60 years later. How long do local stories circulate before they start to die out? Really? The Gospels were written some 60 years later. Mark, the first Gospel, was written in about 65 to 70 CE, 30 to 35 years after the death of Jesus. John's Gospel isn't written until 85 to 90, 55 to 60 years after the events allegedly occurred. Dr. Habermas, how could John have written this Gospel? Wouldn't the local stories about Jesus have died out by then? On page 51, Strobel says, without question, the amount of testimony and corroboration of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances is staggering. To put it into perspective, if you were to call each of the witnesses to a court of law to be cross-examined for just 15 minutes each, and you went around the clock without a break, it would take you from breakfast on Monday until dinner on Friday to hear them all. After listening to 129 straight hours of eyewitness testimony, who could possibly walk away unconvinced? Indeed. So if there really are 516 eyewitnesses to the alleged greatest event in all of history, why do we not have a single account of it directly from any of these witnesses? The Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses. They are not direct testimony of a resurrection. Acts is not written by an eyewitness to these events. None of these quote anyone that the authors claim to have spoken to directly that relate a story of having seen a risen Jesus. Before you could have the 129 hours of testimony of eyewitnesses to a resurrection, one would first need to identify and find these alleged witnesses. The few that we do have names for, none of them wrote of having seen a risen Jesus. We cannot predict what their testimony would be based on this scant evidence. The best evidence we have is for Peter. Multiple authors claim that Peter saw a risen Jesus and that he spoke of having seen a risen Jesus. Most likely he thought he did. It was likely a bereavement hallucination, but it is likely that he thought he saw a risen Jesus. But even with all we have for Peter having seen a risen Jesus, we have no direct account from Peter as to what he saw. Habermas then tackles the question of whether it's possible the appearances are legendary, especially since the number of appearances increases in the later Gospels, with Mark having none and John having the most. To which Gary replies that Strobel is forgetting that the 1 Corinthians 15 creed predates the Gospel and makes the claim of the highest number of people having seen a risen Jesus. I disagree with Habermas. I don't think the creed points to the Gospel accounts not being a growing legend, but rather, I think it supports it. I think the Luke author, being aware of the creed, decided that there had to be appearances, so he adds some. The Matthew author adds more, and the John author adds even more, so that the creed looks more plausible. I think it's a case of the creed guiding the narrative. Habermas then makes the case for why he thinks it's unlikely the appearances were hallucinations. He argues, people who hallucinate need a fertile mind of expectancy or anticipation. Peter was hard-headed, for goodness sake. James was a skeptic. Certainly not good candidates for hallucinations. Gary fails to take into account that Peter was grieving. He is grieved about denying Jesus and the loss of Jesus. Bereavement hallucinations are common. They don't come to those anticipating them or expecting them. It's entirely plausible that Peter had a bereavement hallucination of Jesus, which he then took as a resurrected Jesus. He likely told this to others, some of whom also then believed that Jesus was risen. I say some, as even the Gospels record some of the disciples having doubted. It's unclear if all of the disciples ever believed. Gary rightly points out that mass hallucinations, or multiple people having the same hallucination at the same time, is not something we have record of. The closest we come is sightings of the Virgin Mary, which, when the witnesses are asked, saw different things. But we need not examine how this could occur, as we have little reason to think that it did occur, ever. Even in his magnum opus on the resurrection, Habermas agrees that group appearances is not one of his minimal facts that are agreed on by scholars as having occurred. Gary puts the final nail in the coffin himself. If we establish the gospel accounts as being reliable, how do you account for the disciples eating with Jesus and touching him? How does he walk along with two of them on the road to Emmaus? Indeed, if you could establish the gospel accounts were reliable, then one certainly would need to accept that what they said really did happen. The problem lies in the inability to establish the gospel accounts to be reliable, particularly Matthew with his hundreds of zombies walking around Jerusalem and the temple veil being torn in two. Even some believing scholars, like Mike Licona, agree that this isn't literally true. Before I could believe in the resurrection of Jesus, I would need to see a robust case for the reliability of the Gospels. This is the factor that Strobel has missed. If Strobel were indeed a skeptic wanting to find out if Jesus really rose from the dead, why does he only go to apologists? Why does he examine only one side of the equation? And most importantly, why does he only consider what is in the Bible? The entire point of the excursion is to examine the truth claims behind Christianity and to get his wife out of this cult. If one wants to find the basis for this claim, one cannot merely examine the claim. This would be like someone telling you that Bitcoin is a great investment, and to find out if Bitcoin is in fact a good investment, the only thing you look at is advertisements by Bitcoin about their product. Considering that Strobel put so little effort into finding the basis for the claims of Christianity, I conclude that his case for Christ has no more substance than Bitcoin. Strobel concludes the book by asking Habermas the importance of the resurrection, and Habermas responds by telling Strobel about the death of his wife Debbie from stomach cancer. As his wife was in bed, suffering and dying, Habermas was understandably distraught. His students asked him, "Aren't you glad about the resurrection?" Which got him to thinking about if the resurrection worked 2,000 years ago, then Debbie's death had an answer. He says that answer still works for him. I get that. I went through a similar process with the stillbirth of my own first child. But this reduces Christianity to a crutch to cling to in times of pain. And while we do need such crutches at various points in our lives, wouldn't you be better off with a real crutch than an imaginary one? Like the strength of friends and family to lean on. And as you come out of it, knowing you did that. That was you that bore up to the pain and made it through. Not an imaginary friend that did it for you. This, to me, is the power of being an atheist. Knowing that when I make it through the bad times, it's me, my power, my strength that gets me through, with little help from my friends. I don't need to cling to a fairy tale like the man who lost his daughter and was unaware of what her life was really about. I can cling to reality and still live my life. And you can too.